Network.
Good evening. Leading the news this Monday, there was more violence between black factions in South Africa. Canada's civil servants walked off the job in that nation's first strike by public employees. The Soviet Republic of Tajikistan and the Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia both declared their independence. We'll have the details in our news summary in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, Charlene Hunter-Galt profiles Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. Charles Krause reports from Moscow on what it's like to be Jewish in the new Soviet Union. And we talk with author Betty Bell-Lord about what went wrong with communism.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T connects the world, from equipment to networking, from computers to communications. AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you.
Fighting between South Africa's black political factions raged today in townships around Johannesburg. At least 65 people have died in the violence since Sunday. Leaders of the two main black political groups, the African National Congress and the Inkatha Freedom Party, condemned the clashes. The groups and the government are scheduled to sign a peace accord on Saturday aimed at ending political violence. We have more from Judy Aslett of Independent Television News in Johannesburg.
Early morning in the townships of Soweto, and residents sift through the ruins of their homes. These are the latest victims of the violence, which has continued in the townships now for the past 18 months. This was the scene in Soweto last night, when supporters of Inkatha and the ANC fought pitched battles in the streets. It's still not clear who fired the first shot. Residents standing outside their homes this morning also focused much of their anger against the police. While their houses were being stoned and looted, they told us, the security forces stood back and did nothing. Under the accords due to be signed this weekend, gatherings like the Inkatha rally yesterday would have to be strictly monitored, with all political parties undertaking to prevent their members from carrying any kind of weapon. The police and the army would also fall under a strict code of conduct, where they would be compelled to arrest anyone they suspected of committing a crime. To date, just one man has been arrested after yesterday's carnage, something black leaders say they find hard to accept.
Tonight, spokesmen for both the ANC and Inkatha said the violence would not deter them from signing the peace agreement next weekend. Jim?
The Philippine Senate's Foreign Relations Committee today said no to continued U.S. military operations at the Subic Bay Naval Base. In Washington, President Bush said the United States would not change its $203 million a year for 10 years offer. State Department spokesman Richard Boucher said this.
We think that the agreement is a good one. It's one which serves the interests of both our countries. Clearly, however, ratification of the accord is a decision which Filipinos will have to make. Today's vote is not the final vote. The Philippine Senate, sitting as a committee of the whole, will now debate the merits of the agreement. It is still possible that the Philippine Senate could ratify it. President Aquino is waging a vigorous campaign in favor of this agreement. She plans to lead a People Power March tomorrow to underscore to the Senate the solid popular base for continuing a security relationship with the United States.
And what happens if, indeed, it is rejected?
Well, I think, as we've said, we would then have to withdraw.
Federal employees in Canada today walked off the job in a nationwide strike to protest a proposed one-year freeze on wages. Almost all government services were affected by the walkout. At Toronto's International Airport, nearly two-thirds of the flights were delayed or canceled. Pickets began shortly after midnight at U.S. border crossings, causing major backups. Union officials have threatened to shut down the country's harbors and bridges.
Another Soviet republic declared independence today. This time it was Tajikistan in Central Asia. It also scheduled a presidential election for October 27th. Azerbaijan's president appeared headed for an overwhelming victory today. In that republic's first elections, the former communist ran uncontested because opposition candidates refused to run, charging the election was a fraud.
Mikhail Gorbachev is sending an envoy to the Middle East to seek help for the failing Soviet economy. A Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman said the envoy, Evgeny Primakov, will leave tomorrow for talks in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. He'll carry messages from Gorbachev for each leader, but will not be discussing the proposed Middle East peace conference for the region. The spokesman also said another envoy will leave for a similar economic mission in Germany later this week.
There was more fighting today between Croats and Serbs in Yugoslavia. The worst fighting was in central Croatia, where there were reports the last major Croat stronghold fell to Serbian rebels. The battle began over territory after Croatia declared independence in June. The Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia is heading for independence. Early returns today from a referendum there showed overwhelming support for such a declaration. But Macedonian officials say, unlike Croatia and Slovenia, they want to stay part of a loose confederation of Yugoslav states.
The dispute between Israel and the United States over loan guarantees continued today. In a radio interview, Israeli Prime Minister Shamir warned that Israel's participation in a Middle East peace conference was not a sure thing. He said Israel would walk away if differences over Palestinian representation at the talks were not solved. He also said Israel would continue to settle Jews in the occupied territories, a policy the U.S. opposes. Both issues resurfaced after the Bush administration proposed a postponement of the guarantees until after the peace conference in October. White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater said today he believed there was a good chance the two countries will solve their dispute.
President Bush said today he was confident the Senate would vote to confirm Clarence Thomas. Mr. Bush told a group of black educators there's a fight on, but he was pleased by the support his Supreme Court nominee has received. The Senate Judiciary Committee begins hearings on the Thomas nomination tomorrow.
A grand jury in Indiana today indicted former heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson on rape and other charges. The charges arise from Tyson's alleged assault on an 18-year-old beauty pageant contestant on July 19th. Tyson could face up to 63 years in jail if convicted. That's it for the news summary. Still to come on the NewsHour, a major profile of Clarence Thomas, a report on Jews in the new Soviet Union, and Betty Bow-Lord on why communism failed.
Who is this man, Clarence Thomas, the man President Bush wants on the U.S. Supreme Court? The answer to that question is our lead story tonight. The storyteller is Charlene Hunter-Gault.
I thank all of those who have helped me along the way and who've helped me to this point and this moment in my life, especially my grandparents who are my mother, and the nuns, all of whom were adamant that I grow up to make something of myself.
Almost exactly 7 years ago, in 1983, in the last conversation that I had with my grandfather, he told me to stand up for what I believe in, and I've attempted to do that, and it is uncomfortable and it is difficult. But I think the choice between principle and popularity is a choice that each individual has to make, and I've made mine, and I'll live with the consequences.
Clarence Thomas's words opening a window into himself at the announcement of his Supreme Court nomination this summer and during his confirmation hearings for the Court of Appeals in 1990. To his critics, Thomas is a man who is aloof, uncaring, and who believes that his life is testimony to the power of the individual to rise above his circumstances on his own, without any help. To his supporters, he is just the opposite, and is being persecuted because he dares to challenge traditional civil rights orthodoxy. To try and figure out just who this man is, and to open the window a little wider, we travel to some of the places where Thomas's foundations were laid. Starting in Savannah, Georgia, a languidly beautiful river city that still retains a lot of the charm of the Old South, and a lot of its poverty, too. It was into this poverty and the rigid segregation of the Old South that Clarence Thomas was born 43 years ago. He escaped both only because his mother was forced to break up the family in order for any of them to survive. Thomas's sister, Emma May, still lives in the midst of the poverty she and her two brothers were born into, here in the outskirts of Savannah, in a tiny community on the marshes called Pinpoint. But Thomas and his younger brother were sent to live with his mother's parents in Savannah, and those who know Thomas always cite that as the first of several critical turning points in his life. It was in this house where Thomas's mother now lives that Thomas came under the strong influence of his grandfather, Myers Anderson. One of Anderson's business associates in the ice and coal company he owned was Sam Williams. Now in semi-retirement, Williams remembers the grandfather and how he influenced Thomas.
He was one of the brilliantest people that you ever seen that didn't have an education. I mean, he was good.
And what about his relationship with his grandson?
Clarence worked with him a little bit round on the trucks, as a little boy. Then he grew up some, and he put Clarence in school, and he kept him there. He worked hard for them to go to school.
Anderson, a Catholic, chose St. Benedict's, a black Catholic school in Savannah, and that proved to be another critical turning point. Savannah attorney Lester Johnson attended Catholic school in Savannah at the same time.
The nuns had a tremendous impact, not only on Clarence, but on all of us. They gave us the self-esteem that young black children didn't have growing up in Savannah, Georgia. Even though our parents told us we were good, hearing it from a white person made us know that we were good.
The nuns also made sure that their black students were disciplined and prepared to compete.
I think the nuns were then convinced that there's no question that black students are on an equal level, they can compete, and they're going to compete. We're going to make sure that they compete with white students here in Savannah, Georgia, and the other Catholic schools. They would go through these exams, these old exams that they would get, multiple choice questions on English, math, and they would drill us every day. I mean, their motto was, repetition is the mother of studies. They always would tell us that. And you all would do well on standardized tests. Contrary to what the educational field was saying at that time, that blacks couldn't score well on these tests. They were saying, okay, fine, you say they can't, we're going to prove that they can.
Thomas endeared himself to the nuns, and they continued to push him. He won the prestigious Altar Boy Award, and sometime after that, years before public school desegregation, the nuns helped pave the way for his entry into the all-white St. John Vianney Seminary, also in Savannah.
I asked him why he wanted to be a priest, and now everybody seems to think that it was because of his grandfather, and maybe it was, but he told me he felt committed, that there had never been a black priest from Savannah, and that he was going to be Savannah's first black priest, and that priests had a special place in black Catholic Savannah. And so, I think that he thought it was something that would be a commitment to Savannah, to come back as a priest, and also a role model to other young black Catholics.
Thomas pursued his plans for the priesthood at Immaculate Conception Seminary in Missouri. A year later, in 1968, he left the seminary. There's been speculation that a derogatory remark about the shooting of Martin Luther King was the straw that broke the camel's back for him. He has never publicly given a reason. Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts was where Thomas landed next. It, too, was a predominantly white, all-male institution, but it had a pipeline to Savannah's black male students and a reasonably good track record. And once again, it was a nun who pushed him there. Still, it was during the late 60s and the Black Power phase of the Civil Rights Revolution. Thomas found himself caught up in it. Holy Cross President, Father John Brooks.
I think they confronted all the prejudices and bias that were prevalent in the Northeast area. I think most of us are familiar with some of the prejudice coming out of the Boston area that we still experience to some extent, and so it was a difficult scene.
Although Thomas joined the Black Student Union and took to signing his letters with power to the people, he often maintained an independent position.
He was only one of 25 blacks to vote against creating an all-black wing in his dormitory, although when it was set up, he moved in, and he worried about some of the black attitudes on campus. Father Joseph LeBron.
I have become myself very conscious of racism, and almost in some ways all pro-black. One night, a group of blacks came to me and talked to me about this racism. They said, Father, you have to realize there's as much white and black racism here on campus as there is white. In some instances, we as blacks have suffered more from black racism on campus than whites, because some of our own friends get envious or something wrong with us if we date white girls or get involved with white people too much. And in that group, and especially Clarence, I said this before, I don't think there's racism in him at all.
Thomas first married a black woman from Massachusetts whom he met while a student at Holy Cross, but his second wife is white. During his years at Holy Cross, Thomas often discussed his feelings with Father Brooks, who believed he began to get some insight into the young student's character.
He likes to reason problems through, and when he draws a conclusion, he feels very strongly about that conclusion. And he'll articulate his position very, very well. He'll listen to you, but you had better have a pretty compelling argument, I think, to get him to change his mind.
Clarence Thomas next went to Yale Law School in 1971. There, he confronted a situation that would begin to provide a basis for his controversial views on affirmative action. Thomas, who had finished in the top 7% of his Holy Cross class, had been admitted under Yale's new affirmative action program. But the Clarence Thomas, who had been driven all his life by the nuns to excel on the merits, felt unjustifiably stigmatized by certain classmates and faculty. Harry Singleton, an attorney in Washington, D.C., who had been friends with Thomas since their days at Yale, argues that Thomas had no problem with the concept of affirmative action.
Academically, however, we always thought that we were capable of handling ourselves well. But we just needed an opportunity to get in, to get to opportunities that we might not otherwise have because our fathers were not lawyers or doctors or captains of industry who might know someone in the law school or at the university who might be able to say some positive things about us that might get us into school and that, that type of thing. The old boy network, as it were. It works. I mean, it's live.
But Singleton argues that what Thomas came to disapprove of was how he thought the program was being abused.
At that time, the focus was on disadvantaged individuals, disadvantaged students, and so forth. As a result, it was something that he felt was important to talk about, that the affirmative action program not be abused by people who really didn't need it, and not be used by middle-class students from very middle-class and privileged backgrounds to get into the law school.
After Yale, Thomas made a conscious choice not to take a job that would pigeonhole him as a black lawyer. He went to work for then Missouri Attorney General John Danforth, specializing in taxation.
I think that it would be safe to say that his concern would be exactly that not to be pigeonholed, not to be stereotyped, but to be judged on his ability.
From 1977 to 1979, Thomas worked for the Monsanto Company in St. Louis, then returned in 79 to the legislative staff of John Danforth, by then a U.S. Senator. Alan Moore, president of a waste management lobbying association, was at that time director of legislation for Danforth and supervised Thomas.
I think that he is what he is and would never try to pretend otherwise or to deny it. I think that what struck me about him was that he didn't want to be earmarked professionally as a black. He wanted to be a mainstream professional who could grow and develop and perform in an area that was open to white America, if you will, and not be put aside somehow into one of those jobs, especially a Washington-type job that dealt with the area of civil rights, the area where race played in the forefront.
Given that point of view, Thomas, once a Democrat, was troubled when President Reagan tapped him to head the Office of Civil Rights as Assistant Secretary of Education.
I remember when he got that offer, and he came to me and said, "What should I do?" And I said, "You take it." He said, "How can I take it? It violates what I have tried to stand for professionally. That is, not to allow myself to get caught up in one of these black boxes, these boxes for black people. Civil rights. Why can't they let me be an assistant secretary of some other department? I said, they won't. They just won't. You take it and you make the best of it.
There are those who say that this marked another critical turning point in Clarence Thomas's life, one where he abandoned principle for political expediency. His supporters don't agree.
I don't think that he began to scheme and plot. How can I adjust my thinking? How can I endear myself to the Reagan administration? In fact, he used to have some rather significant battles behind the scenes in the Reagan administration, and had he wanted to, had he been politically motivated, I think he would have made sure that those battles became public, that it was somehow perceived that here was this champion, this fighter. Instead, he agonized rather quietly and loyally.
The arguments were said to have taken place during Thomas's next Reagan administration assignment, when he took over in 1982 as head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the agency charged with enforcing the various federal statutes guaranteeing equal employment opportunity. In short, another job dealing with civil rights. Early in his tenure, Thomas emerged as a frequent opponent of Assistant Attorney General Brad Reynolds over what Thomas perceived to be the Justice Department's lack of civil rights enforcement. But critics contend that with President Reagan's re-election in 1984, Thomas threw in the towel and joined the other side. Thomas has dismissed such charges as garbage. His longtime friend offered another explanation.
When called upon by the Reagan administration to do this civil rights job, you know, there was the thought that we look around and see who were the people to choose from to do the job, and perhaps it was better that he go in and take this on to protect whatever we, had going at that point.
But in Thomas's 8-year term, he came under fire for not only failing to adequately protect blacks, women, and the aged, but in fact, he was charged with inaction, incompetence, and hostility towards victims' rights. Some of the criticism dealt with how the $160 million agency was administered, but a more fundamental criticism centered on the EEOC's mission and how it had changed under a leader who philosophically believed that where historic patterns and practices of discrimination existed, in his words, there is no governmental solution. After a series of interviews with Thomas that spanned 5 years, reporter Juan Williams wrote, Thomas believes that government simply cannot make amends and therefore should not try. The best it can do is deal a clean deck and let the game resume. Some Thomas observers contend that it is Thomas's roots that have brought him to this point, and that they see the stamp of his grandfather in his fierce dedication to the power of the individual to affect his or her own destiny, bootstrap conservatism. But others, like Savannah's Sam Williams, strongly disagree.
No, I wouldn't say that came from his grandfather. The average black person, he believed that the country owes him something, the way he had been treated, and I agree with that. And that was part of the way his grandparents thought. They do owe us something because we've been tramped on from the beginning of slavery till up until now. And you see right there where it causes a cross with Clarence. I don't think Clarence think about that the United States owe us something. They owe us everything. Now, I'm not saying that he don't sympathize with some of it, but I don't think he see that part. And that boot, I don't have no boots. Don't have nowhere to get the boots from. So I can't pull up by my bootstrap.
Critics also cite another example of how they believe Thomas perverted his grandfather's lessons on self-reliance. Speaking on the debilitating effects of government help during a 1980 meeting of conservative blacks, Thomas said of his sister, she even gets mad when the mailman is late with her welfare check. That's how dependent she is. Friends say that Thomas regretted the statement and that his way of handling it demonstrates what kind of individual he really is.
He was using it in a broader context to talk about the need for self-reliance and not to count on your government. He wasn't saying she was a bad person or he was anti-welfare. Used it as an example. It showed up in the papers. He saw the article. It was in December. He saw the article. He was horrified at how it read because he too said, oh my gosh, this looks like I'm criticizing my sister, my older sister, the sister to whom he's closest, even though they were raised separately. He went out and he got in his car. It was in the middle of an ice storm here in Washington. He drove to Savannah. He gathered his mother and his sister and his grandparents. He sat them down. He pulled out the article. He read them the article, and he explained to them what he meant and what he didn't mean. So he settled that issue the day it occurred, the day it showed up in the newspapers. Now, of course, it's coming back. People are talking about it and saying, what an insensitive, uncaring person. He acknowledges it was a mistake.
Another position that critics view as an indication of his lack of caring and insensitivity is his espousal of natural law. Critics like law professor Lawrence Tribe argue that natural law has most often been cited to justify moralistic intrusions on personal choice. Father Brooks sees it differently.
Well, I think it seems to me that he believes that the inherent in the person, created by God, is the ability to know some basic rights and wrongs. Some things are right, some things are wrong. You can't change those. You can legislate on, but that doesn't make it right again. So.
Thomas's defense of natural law is being attacked by critics who fear that Thomas would use natural law to affirm a natural right to life for an unborn fetus. That being the case, they worry that he would cast the deciding vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court's decision upholding abortion.
I think that one thing that people automatically assume is that if a person is a Catholic or was a Catholic and has made certain statements about abortion, that they would, upon assuming a judgeship, automatically rule in that fashion simply because that's their personal belief. But what I think lay people don't understand is that lawyers, and Clarence is a lawyer, every day have to do things and say things that personally they would not at all adhere to. And I think that if he is confirmed, that he will look at the issue when it comes before him, and he will analyze it, and if his analysis indicates to him and the majority of the court that Roe v. Wade was wrong, then they'll reverse it. But if his analysis tells him that Roe v. Wade is right or just needs to be modified, I think he will rule in that fashion.
Tomorrow, the attempts to find out specifically what Clarence Thomas believes begin. There will be witnesses on both sides who believe they know. But there are also those who say that because of the kind of man Clarence Thomas is, that just may be impossible.
I hear him in conversation, and he's an extraordinarily independent person. And I don't think you can, I honestly believe I don't think they can predict that. I've read all the cautions and all the concerns they've had, but I'm certain that they can't prove those right now. I think he's an open book. It may surprise people.
Public television and National Public Radio will be covering the Thomas confirmation hearings from start to finish. The NewsHour will provide edited excerpts from the testimony tomorrow and as news warrants. Still ahead, Jews in the new Soviet Union and a conversation about why communism failed.
Now, the Jewish New Year for Jews in the new Soviet Union. Charles Krauss reports.
This could have been any synagogue anywhere in the world, but it was the Choral Synagogue in Moscow, where this morning Jews from across the Soviet Union gathered to usher in the Jewish New Year. What was most remarkable was just how unremarkable and normal it all seemed to be. For centuries, Soviet Jews have been persecuted for their religious beliefs, first by the Tsars, then by the communists. Anti-Semitism was and remains a fact of their everyday life. But this new year, the shofar, the traditional call to worship on Rosh Hashanah, was also a call for Soviet Jews to rejoice. Rabbi Adolf Sheyevich is Moscow's chief rabbi. He says the defeat of communist hardliners is a very positive development, a blessing for the 4 to 5 million Jews who remain in the Soviet Union.
Я однозначно могу сказать, что мы находились...
I can tell you unambiguously that we were on the brink of a catastrophe, and if the coup had succeeded, we would have been thrown back decades and decades into the past. And the regime, even worse than Stalinist, would have again ruled in the country. Now everyone knows what it means, and Jews, of course, could never expect anything good out of it.
In effect, you're saying that you believe that had the coup succeeded, the leaders of the coup might have attempted to make the Jews once again scapegoats for the problems that exist in this country.
Undoubtedly so. I'm confident of that.
Jews had a special reason to fear the coup because Orthodox communists, the hardliners, have a long history of anti-Semitism. For 70 years, beginning with Lenin, the Soviet Communist Party openly discriminated against Jews and tried to stamp out Judaism. Official anti-Semitism reached its peak under Stalin.
Of course, I suffered. I suffered emotionally and psychologically about the situation.
Dr. Boris Gett was a young physician in the early 1950s when Jewish doctors were accused of conspiring to poison Stalin. The charges were false, but it didn't matter. There were purges and executions, arrests and reprisals.
It was a very difficult situation for all the Jewish people. And also for the physicians. It was government politic against Jews. It was government's anti-Semitism.
Official anti-Semitism continued in the Soviet Union until just a few years ago. Jews were officially barred from the diplomatic service and other prestigious jobs in both the government and the party. But with the weakening and now the collapse of communism, there's been a remarkable resurgence of interest in Jewish religious, educational, and cultural life. At the Lenkom, Soviet Russia's most famous repertory theater, there's now a play about Tevye and early anti-Semitism based on the stories of Sholem Aleichem. Elsewhere in Moscow, young Jewish men are once again reading from the Torah, preparing to become teachers and rabbis just like their forefathers, without fear of persecution from the Tsar or from the communists. As recently as 5 years ago, there were no more than a handful of synagogues in all of the Soviet Union. Today, there are 110. Meanwhile, Jewish day schools, like this one at the Choral Synagogue, are filled to capacity. Every nook and cranny, including the sanctuary itself, becomes a classroom. Rabbi Shalom Levine, a Lebovitch rabbi from New York, helps administer the Jewish day school. Ironically, Glasnost has brought with it an upsurge in open anti-Semitism. Nationalist groups and magazines which blame the Jews for Russia's economic and political problems. Nonetheless, Rabbi Levine says Jews in the Soviet Union today enjoy full religious freedom.
I certainly read about anti-Semitic, about Pamyat and things like that. But the 9 months that I am here, and I am openly Jewish wherever I am, I go Shabbos to the Talis Anmi to the shul, and hundreds are doing that. And I never saw anything on the street of anti-Semitism. There is still a difficulties with the economy and political situation, but in the sense of freedom for religion, I think it is, and that gives us the ability to increase our work in over 2 dozen cities where we have centers, schools, synagogues, yeshivas, and things like that.
Still, Jews continue to leave the Soviet Union by the tens of thousands. Every day, the Israeli consulate in Moscow issues 300 to 400 visas, and Israeli officials here expect another 200,000 Soviet Jews to emigrate by the end of the year. But religious persecution and official anti-Semitism are no longer the primary reasons for the continuing exodus. Anatoly Nemark and his family are Zionists.
All my parents, my grandfather and my grandmother, they're thinking that Israel is the motherland of all Jews and all over the world, and so we must go in Israel. I think that every man must live in their motherland. I think so.
But most Soviet Jews are now leaving to obtain a better life for their children, education, and also because of the Soviet Union's worsening economic crisis. Nelly Shumalova is from North Ossetia in Soviet Georgia.
I think that the main thing is economic problem. The main thing, because I was speaking here with people and everybody say economic danger, not discrimination, not discrimination. And now the discrimination is not the question, not the question.
Anti-Semitic literature is sold openly in Moscow, much of it printed by Pamyat, an extreme Russian nationalist group. But unless Pamyat comes to power, which is unlikely, or communist hardliners stage another coup, most Soviet Jews will not leave the Soviet Union for Israel. Millions of them have intermarried, changed their names, and tried to assimilate. Since Stalin's time, Jews have kept a low profile and remained largely outside of government and politics. But that, too, has begun to change. Barred from high positions in the Communist Party, Jews have been active in the democratic movement around Yeltsin. One of the most prominent Jewish politicians represents Moscow's October district in the Congress of People's Deputies. Mikhail Gorbachev lives and votes in the October district, which makes Ilya Zavslavsky, a Jew, Gorbachev's personal representative. Nonetheless, that didn't stop local communists from using anti-Semitic slurs against Zavslavsky during his election campaign.
Why they use this argument against me? Not because I am Jew, because I am anti-communist. And they must make understand to people why anti-communist Zaslavsky is bad. He is bad because he is invalid, disabled people. He is bad because he is Jew. Because if they would say that Zaslavsky is bad because he is anti-communist, it will not make a good impression to people which didn't like communists. So they like for other arguments.
Why did you decide to stay in this country? You could have left. You could have left 10 years ago when things were bad. You could have left 5 years ago when things were quite uncertain. Why have you decided to stay?
It's so-called question of loyalty. For me, Russia is my patrimony, my country. I will not leave this. I can't understand why I must leave my country. I prefer to give to communists the possibility to leave the country if they are Jewish or no. There are a lot of Jewish which are American people, the citizen of United States, and which will not leave United States in all this situation. It's their country, their great country, they are patriots of this country. I think that it's normal when people are patriots of their countries, and like they are patriots of United States and the patriots of Russia.
Other Soviet Jews have thought about leaving, but have concluded so far that their lives are more rewarding in Russia than they would be in Israel or even the United States.
My work means a lot for me. I'm a doctor, and I love my profession.
Dina Merkulova is chief of neurology at the Ministry of Railways Hospital number 3 in Moscow. She knows that if she emigrates, she won't be able to practice medicine in the West.
It is difficult for me to be a beggar because to come there is, we call it in Russian, to be a poor relative there. And maybe someone must cure Soviet people also.
One of the 3 men killed defending the Russian parliament building during the coup was a young architect who was also Jewish. Not a religious Jew, but an assimilated Jew. Ilya Khrushchevsky's death has struck a sharp chord in this fragmented society. Jewish leaders hope his example will reduce anti-Semitism by proving that not only Russians, but Jews also, are patriots ready to die for this great land. Ilya Khrushchevsky's father shares this hope, but thinks it will take time.
People will not be able to purify themselves from it right away, from this anti-Semitism. At least it seems to me this way. But I wish to hope that the death of our son has shown that not only Russians protected the freedom of Russia, but all the citizens of Russia, including the Jews.
Ilya Khrushchevsky is buried alongside the 2 other young men who died defending democracy that long night 3 weeks ago. Their graves have become a shrine for Jews and non-Jews alike. This Rosh Hashanah, as they celebrate the new year, Soviet Jews had a special reason to mourn the death of Ilya Khrushchevsky. They know that he died not only for democracy, but for them.
Finally tonight, we continue our conversations on why communism failed. We're joined by Chinese-born writer Betty Bao Lord, whose books focus principally on China and its people during the Communist Revolution. Her most recent work is Legacies, a Chinese Mosaic. Mrs. Lord observed many of the changes in China when her husband, Winston Lord, was U.S. ambassador there, and she was in China when the student democracy movement in Tiananmen Square was crushed. She was also in Moscow last month as a witness to the aborted coup. Mrs. Lord, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Why do you think communism failed in the Soviet Union?
I think it's the same, whether it was in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or China. In the beginning, it was an ideology that meant hope for people. They thought that through following the roadmap that it outlined, that they could make a better life for their children, for themselves. And so they believed it. They wanted to believe in it. But I think that as time went on, they could see that it did not answer hope. And today they see that it really is quite hopeless. For instance, in China, in the beginning, people wanted to be part of this new transformation of China. They were willing to give up everything to be a little part of it. But they thought of themselves as cogs in a big, giant state machinery. And if they could be of use, fine. They were willing to sacrifice anything because they thought, well, if we build a better life for our children. And they saw, even when the machine went awry and caused tremendous harm, they still hoped against hope that somehow it was the people running the machine. If we just changed the people running this machine, then we could still get a better life for our children. And this, after the Cultural Revolution, where the official numbers were 100 million Chinese were harmed by it. Nevertheless, people still believed. They wanted to believe. But when they saw the change of leadership, and in the last 10 years, the difference between what was happening in the outside world and what was happening to them, they realized, after Tiananmen and the shooting, together with knowledge of the outside world, suddenly they realized the machine is wrong. The system is wrong. No matter who runs the machine, no matter how obedient a cog I am, no matter how much I sacrifice, the machine doesn't work. And they've seen it now in Eastern Europe, where it was enforced by the Soviet soldiers. They've seen it where in Soviet Union, which was the birthplace of communism, overthrown. And I think they feel that it's inevitable that this machine will break down.
Was the hope that it would work, that the machine could work, was that reborn in each generation? Because surely each generation, as it got older, as its members got older, must have come up against the realities and the discrepancy between what was promised and what was said in the ideology and what daily life was like.
I think the first generation under communism wanted to believe very, very much. And then by the time they had children, they were very scared that they pass on their doubts onto their children. They didn't want to do that because the price for having doubts about the system, by that time they realized, were much too high. So I know of people who spent their whole lives lying in front of their children because they were afraid that the children would say the wrong thing in school. So they had a pretense every day at the dinner table for the children.
Well, what about when those children then grew up?
They grew up, they ran into the political movements themselves. It was no longer to escape. For instance, many of these children, they were told they loved their father in the morning when they left to go to school. At school, some teacher might tell them, your father is an evil person. And I heard this from people who actually underwent this experience. They would go home that night and literally sit there and watch their father being transformed in their own eyes. And they couldn't understand it. They didn't understand why they loved their father so much in the morning, and suddenly at night they could see how bad they were, how really, truly bad they were. Of course, as time went on, and the political line changed in China, after all, the roadmap zigged and zagged, and when they were told at the end, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. We said your father was bad, but he really wasn't bad. But now he's dead, and that child has no father to say, I'm sorry to. This is the price of the second generation. And now we have the third generation.
Of course, in China, we just remind people it's more recent. I mean,
Yes,
the Chinese
40
didn't
years.
become communist until 1947.
That's right.
And 48.
49.
49.
Yes.
And of course,
Depending on where you are.
Where you are, yeah, because it crept through, didn't it, as the revolution advanced. Yeah, and in Russia, of course, it was 40 years earlier than that. But do you know personally people who've gone through this kind of psychological experience, the psychological journey of really believing and then becoming disillusioned? Can you describe what happens in people's hearts and souls?
I would say that most everyone that I know were true believers in the beginning. It's hard for me to understand because I find their ideology full of holes to begin with because I've been a questioning person growing up in America.
But these are people, intelligent and cultured people you know and respect. And,
Absolutely. They're surprised now. Looking back, they're surprised. Yeltsin was a Communist Party member. And Zhao Ziyang, who is still under house arrest, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, wanted to reach out to the students. He cried at Tiananmen Square. He was the head of the party.
he was the one who visited the students and petted some of them.
Yes,
and was very
and wanted he said to them, I'm sorry, I came too late. Many, many of them feel that way today.
But describe this, what happens in a person's personality to undergo, I mean, what is the equivalent to us? Is the equivalent to us of somebody who believes passionately and fervently in a religion and in God, and then suddenly discovers he He just doesn't believe. Is it as big, a bigger letdown than that? Tell me.
It's a bigger letdown because it's so personal. It's like a faith and also a marriage. Because it's all-encompassing. People felt that they were willing to do anything. They would sacrifice their children. They did. They had to. Because many times the politics of the situation of the day asked them to give up their parents or give up their wives. People got divorced because of politics. People gave up their children because of politics. And they were all willing to do that. And then slowly they saw that they were asked for all the sacrifices. And the people who ran the system, they got all the perks. And the reality and the ideology became more and further apart. And they felt duped. They felt at first they were, of course, not confident in how they felt. They said, everybody else around me feels this way. There must be something wrong with me. Perhaps I'm guilty. Perhaps I don't understand it fully. Then they evolved into saying they see too much. And then they see that it's not real. And then they say, well, maybe they've made a mistake. Maybe we'll get on the right road. And then after that is finished, they say, my gosh, they've got everything. And I have nothing. And I have sacrificed. For what? To keep the old men in power.
Why do you think communism has been swept away? I mean, it's not only failed in the Soviet Union, in a matter of days, it seems it's almost been vaporized and disappeared, swept away in the Soviet Union before China, when there was such is it just the repression in Tiananmen Square?
Well, I think in many ways, if you reverse the order, perhaps the ending would be different today. I think Tiananmen Square happened, and people in Eastern Europe saw the power of the people and the ruthlessness of the elders. And I think a lot of people took lessons one way or the other from that. And then the fall of Ceausescu, and then now in the Soviet Union as well, I think they realized that they can't hold on for too much longer.
You mean the Soviets, the Eastern Europeans, and
Were
even the
inspired.
Romanians were inspired by the Chinese?
By the Chinese. I just come back from Eastern Europe, and people told me again and again how they, even some Czech students, demonstrated in sympathy with the students in China.
Yeah. And so that then the Soviets saw the students and democracy movement, took heart from that.
Yes.
So what's going to happen now in China with the great founder? I mean, in every way, the symbols have been crashing, and Lenin is being the busts of Lenin are being carted off wholesale. They're even going to, they say now, remove his mummified body from Red Square.
I think that the Chinese people, I think as soon as some of the elders die, there will be a vaporization as well. Because the kinds of feelings, change really comes from the individual feelings, how people feel.
But excuse me, people have been saying that to us and on this program long before the Soviet coup failed and communism swept away there. I mean, that was that's been the standard answer for a couple of years, as soon as the old men die.
Yes.
Is the Moscow experience now going to accelerate things in China?
I think nobody can pinpoint a date when this is going to happen, but certainly it's going to be shorter than it was before the coup failed in the Soviet Union.
We had George Kennan, the father of the containment policy, on this program a few days into the coup attempt. And he said one of the factors was the extraordinary penetration of modern communications.
Absolutely.
Now, in China today, can communications still penetrate? And will everybody there know what's going on?
There's not much to do in China. And so talking is the favorite pastime. And so if one person knows, or a group of people knows, a lot of people will know very soon. And also the communications penetration, VOA, BBC, I had friends call into China right after the coup. They knew about it already. Because even though their press was late on it, they could hear it from the overseas press. So there's no way of containing the news of change.
But are the old men sitting so firmly on the backs with their their repressive police state and so on at the moment, that there's no possibility of any kind of infection?
Oh, I think the infection is there. You just don't know when it's going to surface. I had a friend who had been in jail for 2 years as a result of tenement. And when he got out, he told me the story of how he passed his birthday in jail. Apparently, the jailers gave him the equivalent of what would be a birthday cakes, which they had baked themselves. The jailers came to him and said, you know, this is my job. I've got to keep you in jail, and I've got to interrogate you. But I know someday that you're not going to be sitting in jail, and you might be in power. So let me just present you with a birthday present. This is a lot of the thinking of a lot of the people doing their jobs as communist cadres today. And after the coup in the Soviet Union, there'll be so many more trying to decide, should I leave the party now before it's too late? Should I follow orders or not?
Betty Ballard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, the major stories of this Monday. There was more violence between black factions in South Africa, but the leaders of the African National Congress and the Inkatha movement said they still plan to sign a peace treaty next weekend. Most government services in Canada were disrupted when civil servants went on strike, and 2 more republics declared their independence, Tajikistan in the Soviet Union and Macedonia in Yugoslavia. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the NewsHour tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night with excerpts from the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo,